Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I'm Julia Wiesenberg. I'm the Executive Director of Buckeye Book Fair, and I'll be facilitating our program tonight. We have in store for us a great discussion about a really fascinating topic, and thank you all for being here. The format for tonight is we will have about 30 minutes of a presentation from David and Elise, and then for the final 30 minutes, we will open up for discussion and questions. David Myers and Elise Myers-Walker are a father-daughter writing team from Columbus. They have authored over a dozen books on Ohio history. Tonight, they're going to be talking about the topic of their newest book, published earlier this year, Historic Black Settlements of Ohio. They'll be talking to us about where they came from and what happened to them. David Myers is a graduate of Miami University and OSU. Elise has degrees from Hofstra University and OU, and she is a past board member of the Columbus Historical Society and the Ted Lewis Museum. In 2019, they published Lynching and Mob Violence in Ohio, which began their research into the lives of Black Ohioans in our history. Research from that book led them to information that became the subject of their newest book, which they're discussing with us today, Historic Black Settlements of Ohio. Please feel free to use the chat feature if you have any questions, and we will be saving plenty of time for our discussion. We will be recording today's program, so during the discussion period, if you prefer not to be recorded, please use the chat feature to ask your question, or you can feel free to leave your video off. We would like to thank our sponsor for tonight's program, Ohio Humanities, whose mission is to provide educational humanities programs for all Ohioans. Ohio Humanities is a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and any views, conclusions, or recommendations expressed tonight do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, I am pleased to turn things over to David and Elise to talk to us about what happened to Ohio's historic Black settlements.
Thank you for joining us, by the way. We're really excited to have the opportunity to speak with you today, and we're looking forward to a really great discussion.
Yeah, and thanks to Julia and the Buckeye Book Fair for having us. This is kind of the pilot for these programs, so we hope that we can work out all the technical aspects of it during the course of this evening. It's a good night. I'm not sure where you are, but where we are, it's a good night to be indoors. What we're going to do is we're going to spend about a half an hour going through a presentation on our book, Historic Black Settlements of Ohio. And then we'll pause several times during the course of that to allow you to ask some questions. We're asking that those questions be short. And if you have longer questions, essay type questions, save those for the end when we'll have more time to discuss them.
We know that a couple of descendants from these regions are here with us tonight. So thank you so much for coming. We're really excited to speak with you. We are historians, and we love the opportunity that we have to tell the stories of traditionally marginalized people. But this story isn't exactly our story. It's an American story, and we are Americans, but we are not Black Americans. We are not the descendants of slaves.
We're not people of color.
So we really love that, again, the descendants of these people are actually here tonight to give the broader insight that we can't even possibly begin to bring to the table.
As I said, during our presentation, we want to provide ample opportunity for questions, but we also have a lot of material to cover. So if your question requires an essay answer, please hold it until the end.
But we do want them. If you have them, we are more than willing to talk for a long time at the end.
Owing to a common border with the slave states of Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky, Ohio became a destination for people of color prior to the Civil War. Some were already free, while others were runaways. Still others were brought to the Buckeye State by their owners, who had decided to give them their freedom. But none would become American citizens until the Civil War ended and the 14th Amendment was ratified. It provided all men, but not women, with the right to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But until then, they lived in a sort of twilight zone, seldom fully escaping from the deep shadow of slavery. It is estimated that there was once as many as 100 Black settlements in Ohio, though little trace of them remains today. Although they were not the first and would not be the last, the so-called Randolph slaves were perhaps the most problematic group of formerly enslaved people to settle in Ohio. And the treatment they were accorded reflected both the best and the worst qualities of the state's citizenry. John Randolph of Roanoke was regarded as a kindly master, if such a thing can be. In his will, Randolph bequeathed his slaves both their freedom and enough money to purchase land for them in Ohio. As executor of Randolph's will, Judge William Lee of Virginia bought 3,200 acres of land for the former slaves in Mercer County, Ohio. In 1846, nearly 400 of them arrived by canal boat in the town of New Bremen. However, a large crowd of angry white citizens refused to allow them to disembark. As a result, the Randolph slaves were dispersed to a handful of communities in neighboring counties. Their intended destination was Carthagena, the largest such settlement in the state, with 600 families. Carthagena had its beginnings in 1835, when Augustus Waddles, a Quaker from Connecticut, decided to establish a manual trade school for Black students. Over the ensuing years, Levi Coffin, the so-called president of the Underground Railroad, helped to settle many free Blacks and fugitive slaves near Waddles' school. In 1840, Charles Moore, who was biracial, platted the village of Carthagena on land purchased by his mother, making it the first community in Ohio laid out by a person of color. The residents of Carthagena were blessed with good land and set about making the most of it. But like most Black settlers, they left behind few written records. However, there were a few notable exceptions. Mary Frances McCrae, a former slave from Kentucky, lived there for several years. Her husband and son later wrote a biography of this remarkable woman. Another resident of Carthagena, George Akers, enlisted in the 55th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, where he served with distinction and was mentioned in the writings of others. Like most Black settlements, Carthagena was an agrarian community, but not all of the residents were content to be farmers, so they eventually sold their land to the local German settlers. Some of the Randolph slaves found refuge in Rossville, just across the Great Miami River from Piqua in Miami County. Black children in Rossville attended their own school, taught by Black teachers. An annual reunion of ex-Randolph slaves started in Rossville and continued for several generations. In 1904, former slaves York Reel and Charles Joe Moten sued to recover the 3,200 acres of land in Mercer County that had been denied them, but the court ruled that the statute of limitations had expired. Much of Rossville was swept away in the 1913 flood. Like many of these Black settlements, little remains of Rossville today, save for a cemetery. Another group of former Randolph slaves settled in the village of Rumley in Shelby County. Rumley was laid out in 1837, and the first two lots were sold to George and Joel Goines. The Goines brothers may have actually platted it for the original owner. The brothers were free Blacks who had migrated from the Lett settlement near Zanesville, Ohio. Joel and George built a hotel and livery stable and were partners in a grist mill and a sawmill. Like most Black settlements, the church was of utmost importance. Rumley had 3 altogether and 3 saloons. Rumley was connected to other nearby settlements such as Carthagena, Wren, and Middle Creek by family ties. At one time, the African-American population of Rumley reached 400. But the clash between pro and anti-slavery factions drove many of its Black residents away during the Civil War.
So we've had a question about Montgomery County. Sherry is saying that she wants to know if we found anything about Montgomery County because we don't have a chapter on it in the book. But she knows that there was an Africa town and there was a thriving Black community in Dayton before the Civil War. So you want to talk a little bit about why there's some omissions and the concept of Africa town?
Yeah. Africa town.
Or Little Africa.
Or Little Africa. That was generally a slur. So there were a lot of places where there were people of color gathered together were called Africa town.
Sometimes it was a derogatory term that was retaken by the people and made no longer a slur, taken on and accepted and worn proudly, but usually it did start out as a derogatory way to refer to where the Black people lived in town.
Yeah, there we do have some information on Black settlers in Montgomery County, which will be in a later book, but it's not an isolated community per se. I mean, it was fairly closely associated with the whites living in the same vicinity. So our focus was basically on those that kind of stood alone.
Also, you said Montgomery County is a county that's not included in the book. We know that there's stuff that we missed. And in fact, even in the past year, new research, new studies have come to light, a lot more data on some places than we were ever able to see before. We used what we were able to find, knowing full well that there are, 100 some more communities that just...
Yeah, we came up with information on 43. And others we know of the names, but finding, good solid history on them, it's proved to be very elusive. We're hoping, though, it will come out. And some of the people that are listening tonight have actually come up with some.
Absolutely. And we know, I'm sure that there's stuff in people's family history. We are sure that people have hope chests and boxes and photographs and things in their homes.
Or letters.
But that's the kind of stuff that we are unable to access before a book. And it's sort of the nature of our books that we write them with everything that we have available, and then people come up to us and go, by the way, and they open up a whole photo book of information with dates and names and things that we not only had no idea about, but there was no possible way for us to access that before those people brought it to us, and they wouldn't have brought it to us if they didn't see that we wrote a book in the first place. So that's why we don't claim that this is exhaustive by any means. We claim that this is the best we could possibly do at the time that we did it. Right.
And as I said, we have some information on Dayton. It'll appear, I'm guessing, in about 2 years in a book that's about the Underground Railroad. Another large Black settlement was Longtown in Darke County near Greenville. In 1818, former slave James Clements bought at least 320 acres of land and settled there with his wife, Sophia. Originally from Virginia, Clemens not only founded the community, but was instrumental in starting a school, donated land for a church, and established a public cemetery. The settlement soon extended into Indiana as well, where the Union Literary Institute was opened by anti-slavery Quakers. Not surprisingly, there was a lot of Underground Railroad activity in Darke County, and slave hunters would sometimes come looking for runaways. But many members of the community grew restless, were drawn to the cities, hoping to find greater opportunities. They obtained work as laborers on the docks, aboard steamships, or as porters and cooks on railroads. W.E.B. Du Bois visited Darke County in 1909, possibly in search of his own roots. He was struck by how many light-complected residents were there. The settlement was already losing its ethnic identity. There were several black settlements at the very bottom of the state in Lawrence and Gallia counties. The communities of Pope Patch, Black Fork, and Burlington were founded in the vicinity of Ohio's pioneering iron furnaces. The owners of these furnaces, men such as John Campbell, the founder of Ironton, welcomed the black men who came to them for jobs. In some instances, the owners were also active in the Underground Railroad, helping to conceal the runaway slaves who escaped across the Ohio River. A number of former slaves also did what they could to help others escape. Some of these brave men and women are remembered as conductors on the Underground Railroad. But many more enlisted in the Union Army. Ohio contributed more volunteers to the 55th Massachusetts Colored Infantry than any other state. And still others became entrepreneurs, educators, doctors, and writers. But to do so, most had to leave the settlements.
We haven't received any new questions by text yet. If you have any, please go ahead and text us. But otherwise, in the effort of keeping moving, we're going to keep moving.
Vestiges of Ohio's black settlements are few and far between. Although there are many alleged Underground Railroad houses, most of the homes that were once part of black settlements have vanished. However, some related buildings remain, which help to tell the story. For example, Benjamin Lundy, a Quaker and newspaper publisher, operated a free labor store, one that did not sell items produced by slaves. In his eulogy, William Lloyd Garrison, the celebrated abolitionist, recognized Lundy as the, quote, first of our countrymen who devoted his life and all his power exclusively to the cause of the slaves.
Oh.
Yeah. I want to point out this is in Mount Pleasant, and the building is disintegrating. However, recently the Ohio History Connection obtained title to it, so they've been able to stabilize it. But in my opinion, this is one of the most important buildings in the history of the Underground Railroad. And it's here in Ohio, and most people have no knowledge of it. In 1800, 3 years before Ohio became a state, there were some 800 Quaker families living here. 26 years later, there were more than 8,000 Quakers living in Belmont, Harrison, Columbiana, and Jefferson counties. They moved here specifically to aid in the anti-slavery movement, and in some cases helped to settle fugitive slaves. In 1831, Elizabeth Harvey, with the help of her Quaker neighbors, built the Harveysburg Free Black School. Wealthy plantation owners would send their mixed-race children to Ohio so that they could be free and obtain a good education. This was the home of J.T.A. Bostwick, a black school teacher and postmaster in Carthagena. It is typical of the style of architecture that was prevalent in black settlements in northwestern Ohio. The nearby Carthagena Cemetery marks the site of what was once the largest black settlement in the United States. It is separated by an iron fence from the adjoining Roman Catholic cemetery. The Greenville Negro settlement, later called Longtown, spanned the Ohio-Indiana border. James and Sophia Clemens were the original founders. Their home and barn remain. York Reel and his friend Joe Moten sued in court to recover the land promised to the former slaves of John Randolph. Reel's home was operated as a Black History Museum until fairly recently, when Helen Gilmore, the woman who ran it, passed away. Jackson African Cemetery in Rossville, just across the bridge from Piqua, has largely disappeared, although a few markers remain. Rossville was home to many former Randolph slaves. Olive Furnace was one of 87 iron furnaces in the Hanging Rock region. Owned by abolitionist John Campbell, it had a workforce largely drawn from fugitive slaves and freemen. Each furnace required 100 workers, and many of them were Black. Formerly enslaved men, such as those from the Twyman colony, often found work in the region's many iron furnaces and at the same pay as the white men they worked beside. Indian Lake now covers much of the area where the Warwick colonists were settled. As a result, the only evidence of its existence are a few poorly maintained graves. By contrast, the Lambert Land settlement has an impressive monument and a well-groomed cemetery, although none of the original buildings are known to have survived. On the day we stopped by, a great-great-grandson of one of the original settlers happened to be there, but he knew little about the community's history. Massey's Creek Cemetery is about as picturesque as a cemetery can get, with many impressive monuments. It is close by Wilberforce, one of the few Black settlements that still maintains strong ties to its past. Although difficult to find, Captina AME Cemetery features a monument to Alexander Sandy Harper, a leader of the community and a prominent conductor on the Underground Railroad. This African-American cemetery east of Wren was shared by two churches, St. Mary's African Methodist Episcopal and Second Zion Baptist Church. It is located about a mile off the highway on a muddy lane best traveled when the ground is dry or frozen. The Middle Creek or Up the Grove settlement has been documented by anthropologist Jill Rowe, who is descended from some of the original pioneers. When we were there, we spotted a couple of homes in the area that might well have been built by members of the community.
So we actually have a couple of questions this time, a follow-up to the earlier question about Dayton. Sandy says she assumes that we're going to be talking about the First Wesleyan Church and the Underground Railroad. She says it's interesting because she was recently at a presentation by the Franklin County African American Genealogical Society, where they stated that Dayton was not a stop on the Underground Railroad, but her research indicates that it absolutely was. Thing about the Underground Railroad is it was kept a secret as much as possible. You would not even begin to broadcast that that's something you were doing, because it would cause trouble not only for the passengers that you were trying to free, but for you yourself as a white person or a free Black person, especially a free Black person working on it. So I think it's kind of ridiculous to suggest that a place as large as Dayton wouldn't in some way be involved. Well,
especially given the period of time we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about a space of 60 years, essentially, before the Civil War. And to say that nothing happened, is kind of inconceivable.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that there aren't records, isn't too surprising, because, even, Levi Coffin, and people who were prominent Underground Railroad people, and John Parker, they didn't keep records. They didn't. Most of what was written from memory, because if you were caught with the records, then you were guilty of violating the law, and you would have been fined and imprisoned. Mm-hmm. And some of the people who assisted the Underground Railroad were. Some died in jail. Mm-hmm. So I don't know about that. But if you're insisting upon documentation, yes, documentation is often hard to come by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do agree with you, though. I mean, if your research indicates it absolutely was, I would agree that that's spot on, with or without research, because there would almost have to be. There was a question too about PP settlement in Pike County, which we do have details on in our book. We have a chapter on Pike County.
Yeah, that's a very interesting area, because they were settled in among a very racist family. And the whole Pike County episode is interesting because, you can see evidence of the division between Black and white up to this day. Waverly, was a sundown town. And there seems to be a little question of that. You do have, the area of East Jackson, which was also called Carr's Run, where you have people who are multi-ethnic, who are descended from early settlers there. Again, we write some about it, but it's hard to come up with, hard history on them. But we provide what we've been able to come up with.
Yeah, and you actually stumbled into our other question as well about the Black codes and laws that contributed to the establishment of separate communities. I think these communities were going to be separate no matter what, because a lot of what we talk about are large-scale resettlements of formerly enslaved people. So they were already a community unto themselves. You're already talking about taking a community and moving it pretty far out of its element, frankly, and that was part of the problem to usually substandard land in a state they had probably never been to in their lives. So you were already gonna have difficulty with integration, but absolutely, absolutely, laws at the time caused this to happen. We will never apologize for slavery or slave ownership, because obviously that is disgusting and horribly wrong and a crime morally on every level. However, we do concede that it was very, very difficult for some slave owners to free their slaves, even if that's genuinely what they wanted to do, because the structure, the incredibly racist pro-slavery structure of the entire United States, not just the South, made it difficult for them to free their slaves. You couldn't just say, all right, my slaves in Virginia, I am freeing you, and I'm going to give you a chunk of my land here in Virginia to live on. That was illegal. That couldn't happen. That's why they had to be moved to Ohio. So many laws making it more and more difficult, contributing to the separateness, causing the problems. You had a lot of issues where there were local laws where if you were a freed former slave, you had to, whatever town you went to, put up a large sum of money as bond, just in case you did something illegal. You had to prepay your bond.
Yeah, those are the black laws.
Yeah, the black laws, absolutely ridiculous stuff.
Yeah, and when they decided to enforce that in Cincinnati, you had a huge, well, we won't call it a migration, because essentially 1,200 or more of the black residents of Cincinnati were driven out of the town. So yeah, that's we discussed some interesting cases where slave owners tried, or what they had to go through in order to get their slaves to Ohio in order to free them. It wasn't easy, and the farther away you were from a free state, the even more difficult it was. So there's a lot of things to consider. I mean, people were given slaves with the intent that they would free them, and then had difficulty doing so. So it's a very complex issue. We tend to simplify things, and what we try to do is bring out, there's a lot of issues.
All right.
Okay, we'll move on. In the process of researching Ohio's historic Black settlements, we compiled a lot of genealogical information, which we were unable to include in the book. So we've added it to our website. Click on the tab labeled Extras.
We also, this February, on our Instagram, put out lists of every single name of every single settler by their community that we could find. And I am probably going to do it again. We did screenshots this last time, but I'm thinking this upcoming February that we will be actually listing their names in the Instagram. So that's absolutely something that we put out on our social media too, because we think every single name is important. Unfortunately, books have page limits.
Now, if you've clicked on that tab, you scroll down the page until you reach this heading and photo. And that's where the section on the genealogical information begins.
There's the button.
Yeah, and immediately below it are a number of settlements and the names of many of the settlers who are associated with each one. In some cases, these are taken from the wills where they name the slaves who are being freed. In some cases, we've gathered the information from early census records, but this would have added like 6,000 more words, I think, to the book. And under our contract, we couldn't do that. So we put them on a website.
For every letter as it is.
Yeah. When tonight's program was announced, we were contacted by a woman named Katie Burwinkle, who's
Hi, Katie.
Hi, Katie, who wanted to know if we had written about the Hansborough settlement in Highland County. Although we knew it existed, we did not find any information on it at the time we were writing this book. Since then, some information has turned up on the internet, such as this WikiTree page. We think of our book as an introduction to the historic Black settlements of Ohio and encourage others to dig deeper into the stories of these communities. I don't know if Katie would like to tell us a little bit about what.
Well, let's do our last slide.
Okay.
And then we had one more question, and then
Okay.
yeah, I'd love to hear from Katie. Absolutely.
Okay. And as I said, Historic Black Settlements of Ohio tells the story of an important and often neglected chapter in Black history. And Elise and I always say, when we write the books we would want to read.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody had written a book like this, so it fell upon us to do so. And it's not the last word. We hope that others sprout up.
And when we say nobody had written a book like this, we mean no one had written a survey like this. We absolutely know that there are authors much closer to the subject than we are that have written beautiful works on individual families and settlements.
Yeah.
We had a question before we go to Katie about Payne's Crossing. If we wrote it all about Payne's Crossing at Perry Talking Line.
Yes, we do. There again, that's one of those communities where we don't have a lot of information, and what we do have is largely through the eyes of the white people who lived in the area. But there's some interesting stories there, and so we have included Payne's Crossing. Unfortunately, Payne's Crossing, is in the middle of a forest, and not much is there to tell you. There's a cemetery, but it's an interesting story because with Payne's Crossing, a lot of those people moved to Michigan, and we discussed the fact that the reason for why so many of these settlements disappeared, virtually all of them, and that's because once the Civil War was over, the residents of those communities were free to go wherever they wanted to go, and they may not have wanted to come to Ohio. This is just where they were brought and settled, or it was a relatively safe refuge for them. But like a lot of their white counterparts at that time, they were looking west for greater opportunities. Cheaper land was opening up, opening to the west and to the northwest. And it just so happened that in Michigan, quite a bit of land opened up. It was cheaper than land in Ohio. And a number of these African Americans who had started out in Ohio ended up moving. And Marcia Stewart, who's signed on tonight, that's her particular area of interest. And she contacted us earlier. And the old-time settlers reunions, which she can tell you about, provide a lot of information on the movement of people from the Payne's Crossing area up to Michigan. And if I were from Michigan, I might even write a book about it, because I think there's a lot of information up there.
Caveat: we don't write books about Michigan. Yeah, so at this point, and we're not the admins, so we can't unmute people, but we'd love to cede the floor absolutely to Katie, Marcia, and anybody else who has anything to share, or anybody else who has any questions for us.
I don't know.
Hi.
I am Katie Burwinkle, and I'm from Highland County. I'm with the Highland County Historical Society. And I'll just mention a little bit about Hansborough. Needs a little bit of background. I did a project with the Historical Society on our Lincoln School. It was the all-black school here in Hillsborough, and they were part of the first Northern challenge to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. This was the first case to get to the Supreme Court, was here in Hillsborough, and we did a project on that here in Hillsborough, did a documentary. And after that project, just as you guys had said about more information starts to come to you after you finish your project, we felt like this project still had life, and we started looking into what Hillsborough was like prior to 1869 when the Lincoln School opened. And that's what brought Hansborough to our attention. And this was a Black settlement we had not really heard of, and started looking into it. It's often mentioned in the Philanthropist, which was the abolitionist newspaper of the time, which is an interesting document. And William Hansborough was from Culpeper, Virginia, and his wife passed away, and he married one of his slaves. And they began to have children, and they came up here to Highland County, Liberty Township, and bought property with the intention of moving up here. But William passed away before they actually moved. And so his son, Philip, and his wife and the children all moved up here and started this Hansborough community, which thrived. They had log buildings, they built a school, they built a church, they have a cemetery, and that cemetery still exists, but now that land is private land. But we've been researching it, and it's kind of a neat story. And it kind of, once the Lincoln School opened in 1869, 1870, the people who attended the school in Hansborough began coming into Hillsborough. And I think that kind of was the beginning of the demise of Hansborough. The people assimilated down in towards the Hillsborough area. But that's sort of the story of Hansborough.
Thank you.
Yeah, in our book, we write about the Gist settlement in
Yeah.
Hillsborough.
And that's nearby. That's very near the Hansborough.
Yeah, I could see that in the little bit we were able to find after you contacted us, which is, there's a good story there too. And there's quite a bit in the local newspapers because there was several trials involving the Gist settlement. This was one of those unfortunate situations of which there were many, in which the agent didn't deed the property over to the actual formerly enslaved people.
We say in a lot of these cases that the agents are usually woefully inept or ridiculously corrupt, and it's difficult to tell this far in the future which one they were, but yeah, they rarely did right by their charges.
Yeah. So you end up with a situation where land has been purchased for these former slaves. They've settled on it, but they don't own title to it. And so in that case, since you don't have personal ownership for it, perhaps you don't pay taxes. And because you don't have a deed. And so what eventually happened, and I think it happened in the Gist settlement in Hillsborough, as far as I remember, is that it went to court. They owed taxes on it, and so they sold the land out from under them in order to pay off the fines. And so that's how they lost the land. And that happened in at least a half dozen different communities across Ohio.
It's still a struggle for them today.
Yeah, I'm sure. And you also had situations where they would divide up the land among, there'd be a push, when they were together, all, as a community, they could function. But then you had later generations would want to leave. And so they want to divide up the property, and they might sell it off. And so what had once been a kind of a like-minded community now was very diverse, and you had absentee landlords and all the mess that brings about. So it's a fascinating story, though.
We had a message from John Wittenberg, who says that Ann Kramer and the Lancaster Geological Society has a lot of research on Payne. So the Payne's Crossing settlement, if you want more about that, I'm hearing Ann Kramer and the Lancaster Genealogical Society has that for
you. We quoted some of their.
We did.
Yeah, in our chapter on that. But there's people out there doing work, and there's been several digs going on in the past 10 years where they've been able to come up with additional information just from an archaeological and anthropological perspective.
We're also seeing a lot of stuff that's been common knowledge kind of in the community and in the town where it is, but didn't get the greater attention and funding until recently. We've had a lot of that coming up too. So I've always known about that. Why are we pretending like that's new? Well, some people have recently just discovered it, and they're making more of a, like, they're making a bigger noise about it. So that's cool, because, you know, anytime you can go back and look into that stuff with more funding and more enthusiasm, that's always a plus.
What you also run into is there's collectors that have knowledge, and they like to hoard it. And I don't know what they're hoarding it for.
Well, and there was, Sherry did say earlier that there are families who have their information. They feel fear, concern, uncomfortable sharing with the experts or the you know, people in charge. And I mean, we absolutely get that. We 100% understand why. You know, you don't know us from anybody. Why should you trust us with our stuff? We have had, not on this book so much, but in other ones, we have literally met people in dark parking lots in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, to take pictures of stuff because they didn't want to leave it with us for a second. Our goal is to share it with everybody, because this is your history, but it's everybody's history too. But I 100% understand why you don't want to go, here's everything I've done in my whole history, take it somebody I don't know and walk away with it, or twist it in some way that I don't find acceptable or correct. Or we understand the hoarders. We're not condemning them, but we're just saying we know a couple of hoarders, and we actually include some of their stuff in our book. But if we're not aware of them, if other historians, again, the institutions, are not aware of them, you know, hopefully it comes out at some point. But I think far too often you have these collectors who keep stuff so close to the vest, and then they die, and their children, grandchildren, whoever's cleaning out their house doesn't know about it.
It goes in a garage sale, it gets thrown away.
Gets thrown away, yeah. And you end up with that tragic case of, you know, when you're at the antique store, or even worse, a thrift store, and you're looking at old pictures and records and stuff and going, I don't know who these people are, but I wish I did, because I'm sure they had a story.
Yeah, I mean, we dealt with some serious researchers that had been looking at Carthagena for their whole lives. And we had to build trust with them because they'd been burned so many times by people who took their research and passed it off as their own. So our books are always very heavily sourced. You know, there's lots and lots of footnotes, because we don't pretend to have gone out and researched all this stuff ourselves. There's a lot of people whose work needs to be recognized that are out there, you know, we try to bring that recognition to them.
Yeah, Marcia, I'm sorry, Marcia, I know you contacted us before. Do you have anything you want to say the work you're doing?
Yes, I wanted to add something to the black codes that you were talking about. The people, my relatives that came from Payne's Crossing, they're, like I had said before, some of them were children of slave masters who brought them to Ohio for their freedom. But when they got there, Ohio and Indiana had what they called good behavior bonds. And I think you mentioned it with the with black codes of $500. And so the draw to Michigan was the Homestead Act of 1862. And they could, people could go there, homestead the land. They were allowed 160 acres. My parents and my grandfather and my father and his brothers all had farms, and it was homesteaded land. We have Centennial Farms that are still there. We have relatives that are still in that area in central Michigan, which is Mecosta, Isabella, and Mount Calm counties, and which is near Mount Pleasant in Big Rapids, Michigan. But anyway, what I wanted to say is they homesteaded the land altogether. They had probably 624 acres of the homestead land. And they also, people who came owned logging camps, because that was a big draw in Michigan, the pine trees. They owned logging camps. Most of them farmed. I grew up on a farm. My father was, my grandfather, great-grandfather was a runaway slave from the Underground Railroad, came through Canada, settled there in the late 1870s. My mother came from free African Americans, so they were not enslaved. But I mean, you know, it was a draw. I think it was the logging and probably the homestead land that drew the people to that area. I don't know what, there are still probably about 1,400 people that are still there in the area. And here, the third Saturday of August, which has been going on since the late 1800s, we have a family. It's called the Old Settlers Reunion. And there are usually 400 to 500 people that attend because a lot of people have moved to Detroit, Grand Rapids, Lansing, and they come back home for the reunion.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful.
And
yeah,
we have history books written. If you look on the site, we have books for sale too.
Marcia, go ahead and put the link to that website in the chat so everybody can see it, because please.
Oh, I thought I had sent it to you. It's oldsettlersreunion.com.
Okay, I will get it into the chat for you because absolutely we want to point anybody there who's interested.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time reading what you had online because there's nothing else like that I've discovered. You have so many people participating in it.
Yes, and we also have a historical cemetery that's on the National Register. We have 27 Civil War veterans buried there. We had just a ceremony in 2019 where 9 people, well, some were unmarked graves, but we had a dedication ceremony because a lot of the Civil War veterans didn't have headstones. So my sister ordered the headstones through the Veterans Administration. We also have links of, he's from Marietta, Ohio, was in the Revolutionary War. His mother came over on one of the ships. She was, they were indentured servants and housed with the slaves, and that's how he came about. His name was Basil Norman. And we also have a lot of relatives that are still at the Lett settlement in Zanesville.
Yeah, we found that fascinating. In our book, we try to mention as many surnames as we can, early surnames with all communities, just to show the flow, from one community to the other. Because you'll run across the Lett name in several other communities. And the Goins name or Goings or some variation of in several communities, because they kind of seem to have had their own network, that kind of bypassed the white community out there when they moved from one to the other. And you had them, some of them like Godfrey Brown from Greene County. I mean, he's is an incredible individual, very shrewd, very talented, bought a lot of land, then ended up going around to other Black communities and buying land as well for his, his children and grandchildren to settle there. We tried to profile as many people like that as we could, ones who really were able to accomplish and make things of themselves, starting from nothing. And so, and that's why we like your Old Time Settlers website, because it is chock full of information and photographs and paintings. And
well, like you said, there are books there, so if people want to read more on it, absolutely check those out.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you for contacting us.
Absolutely.
Wondering if you could talk a little bit about why there was such a high concentration of these communities here in Ohio. And you had mentioned that some of them did fairly well and others didn't. If you could talk a little bit more about that. Okay.
Well, we're looking at the period basically leading up to the Civil War. And Ohio became a state in 1803. And Ohio was the first state carved out of the Northwest Territory. And it was followed by Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. But from its inception, it was a free state, first state that was a free state from its inception, because that's what the law called for when the Northwest Territory was created. So you had a free state. That made it a kind of a magnet for free Blacks who wanted to escape, the shadow of slavery, and also for fugitives. They knew if they could make it up to Ohio, they would at least be living in a free state. Ohio also had a common border with the slave states of Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And people don't think normally of Pennsylvania as a slave state, but it was. And the reason they tend not to think of it that way is because in it was 1780, they passed a gradual emancipation law. And all this applied to was the children of slaves. So really until the 1840s, Pennsylvania still had slaves. So if you were a fugitive slave going through Pennsylvania, you might be just picked up and enslaved again. Also, because most slave states prohibited releasing slaves within the state, the slave owners had to take them elsewhere if they wanted to release them. And Ohio was just across the border. If you were in Kentucky or Virginia or Pennsylvania, and it was closer than any other free states. In fact, there were so many slave owners bringing their slaves to Ohio and freeing them that you had some Ohio officials complaining that it was becoming a dumping ground for diseased and disabled Blacks who were no longer productive. And you have to remember at the time, sentiment in Ohio was kind of like 50-50. You had about half the population was anti-slavery and about half the population was pro-slavery or had Southern sympathizers.
Well, and with this, you had also a fair population of people that may have been opposed to slavery intellectually, or we're against slavery, obviously we live in a free state, but then not in my backyard. So, totally opposed to slavery as a concept and the South should get rid of it. Oh, you want 400 recently freed enslaved people to set up, down the road for me. No, I'm not okay with that. You had a lot of that kind of sentiment.
Not in my backyard.
Yeah,
I want them to be free.
But just not wrecking up my community and in my town.
Yeah.
And, we write history, and becomes incredibly apparent very quickly how cyclical stuff is, how concepts never go away. The idea of, oh yes, we absolutely want new people and new exciting things, but not here. Don't let them come here. Whoever they is, we don't want them here. And whether they're Irish or Italian or Black or Hispanic or whoever they are, if they are different than us somehow, we don't want them here.
Yeah.
Even if we have no problem with them intellectually, conceptually being in their own place. And it never goes away. And it was equally as bad. You could argue worse, you could argue the same, depending on which lens you're looking through, but same concept as always. I don't want, especially same old things. Oh, they're uneducated. Oh, they're lazy. Oh, they're whatever the stereotype is that never goes away for that other group. It was there.
Yeah.
And raging and socially acceptable. So that's part of it too.
Yeah. Another reason why there were so many in Ohio is because of the Underground Railroad. There were more Underground Railroad routes through Ohio than any other state. And, it was a matter of just crossing the Ohio River and you were on your way to Canaan land. The issue became, as the law changed, from allowing slave owners to come into Ohio and search for these fugitives to where federal marshals were required to hunt them down, to where, white citizens of Ohio were required to assist in tracking them down. I mean, that was kind of what really precipitated the Civil War. Is okay. It's okay if you're going to, if you're going to come here and capture these fugitive slaves, but don't make me do it for you.
It had become uncomfortable for the white people,
Yeah.
and that's why it became a problem.
And you had the fact, a lot of these communities, and especially when we talk about, up in Dark County, but some of the others, they were multi-ethnic communities, multi-racial communities. They intermarried with Shawnee Indians. They had
Well,
Irish trappers. And
well,
things.
and Marcia spoke previously about the children of slave owners. A lot of these freed slaves were rather light-skinned, and we all know the horrors that produces that in that time and place. We all know that comes out of rape of female slaves by their male slave owners. A lot of them, a lot of these slave owners were sending their children and grandchildren, whether they thought of them that way or not, to freedom. So you already ended up with former slaves, but usually on the light skin side, and then intermarrying with the local Native American populations, with the other various ethnic groups around.
Yeah. If there was one topic in this whole book that I would really, really like to have more information on, it's the resort known as Tawawa Springs. This was in Greene County, and it catered to slave owners and their mistresses. And the mistresses were, they're Black slaves, and they would come to Tawawa Springs and bring their entourage with them. They could bring their slaves, they could bring their mistress with them, their children to this resort, and it was okay. Well, Tawawa Springs eventually became the site of Wilberforce College, but a number of these plantation owners actually moved their families to this area. But
their second families.
Yeah, their second families.
Their families with their slaves.
Yeah, and some of them actually remained with them. Others went back to their other families. But it's a very interesting dynamic that was going on at that time that I really wish we knew more about it. There's been a lot of speculative fiction and novels and even an opera written about it. But it's a fascinating subject, is how could this exist in a free state? And there's, it's not commonly known that slaves were used in a lot of the southern counties in Ohio. It wasn't legal, but if you owned a plantation over in, Kentucky, and you owned land in southern Ohio, you just bring your slaves across and have them work down there as well.
Or if you had a plantation in Kentucky, you might rent one of your slaves to somebody working in Cincinnati, and they might just come work for them in Cincinnati as a slave.
Yes.
You still own them, but you've loaned them out to your friend who is working them in a free state.
Yeah, there were hundreds of slaves in Cincinnati who were working to buy their freedom. They came over daily, or even some of them lived there. They would come over from Kentucky. They would work in jobs to raise money to buy their freedom.
There's a question if we know of any historians doing similar work with the early Asian immigrant communities in Ohio. We, in some of our previous books, touch ever so lightly on this, just because again, we like to tell the stories of marginalized populations, but also we like to tell the stories of every single person that's there. And we talk in our coal mining book about the various groups, and there's some, again, very, very lightly we touch on it. I don't personally know anybody who's working on the early Asian immigrant communities in Ohio. Is there anybody?
No.
I'm sorry, I don't know any. I'm sure there is. So we 100% recommend the Ohio Public Libraries. The Ohio Public Library system is amazing here. A lot of what we do because there's fantastic librarians who'd help us out. So I'd say, aside from an internet search, which I'm sure you've already done, maybe check in with librarians and ask if they know anything. They might not personally know someone, but they might know of a great book that could lead you to an author, that could lead you to a group.
Yes, somebody's probably doing it, and they probably are being very secretive about it, because one thing an author doesn't want to do is tip off to other people what they're writing about. we probably talk more openly about what we're working on than most people.
Well, that's because we know sometimes how difficult it can be to get a book off the ground. We frequently at festivals talk to people and they go, yeah, I've been working on a book about this for 15 years, which is great. It's a passion project. We put out a book a year, so we move a lot faster than that. We have the benefit of that we've been doing books with our publisher long enough that we can pretty much just say to them, here's what we want to do, and they don't give us too much trouble. Not that way with first books. And again,
we work with several publishers.
We work with several publishers too. Also, you know, when you spend 15 years on a book, it's very, very close to your heart. You've done a lot of effort, you've done a lot of work into it. But some of these people are definitely going to get their books published. You can see it; they have a plan. Some of these people, it's just a hobby, and you can see that too. And they don't know that yet. My father has some books that he's been working on that may or may never get published, and he appreciates that it's a hobby and interest. And I think that's why we're freer, is we aren't trying to keep any secrets about what we're working on or who we're working on it with. But I know if you have something that you've been working on that long and you really desperately want it to be a book, you know, you want to tip your hat. You don't want to let anybody else know. Early on, we did come into some conflicts with some other authors who were working on similar topics.
Yeah.
And then we've had really weird stuff happen where, and this is just one of those things where nobody's written on a topic ever, and all of a sudden 2 books come out in the same year. It's the same thing that happens with movies, where there'll be suddenly 2 books about, you know, let's say upturned cruise ships or something in the same year. And then they might be related through some staff member, or they might not be. It just might be what came up at that point in time.
Yeah, we wrote a book on the Society of the Banana, which was a Black Hand organization
Organized
in Ohio.
crime.
The first time an organized crime entity was ever prosecuted. And 4 months after our book came out, another book came out on the exact same topic.
There is 4 months in publishing is a very short time. There's no way they could have been aware of our book and turned it around like that. That's not the case. It just so happens that that's when those 2, the same topic, bubbled up like that. So yeah, again, we're sure somebody's doing early Asian immigrant communities, but we are not personally aware of who that is. Talk to a librarian. In general, just talk to a librarian when you get the opportunity to. It's great.
Are there other questions out there?
I haven't seen any more come into the chat. We'll give everybody just one more chance to send us any questions you have before we do our wrap up here. This was really enlightening. I appreciate you talking with us about this topic. It brings together so many threads of Ohio history, so it's so fascinating.
Yeah, and if you know you leave tonight or tomorrow and you think, oh man, I know what I wanted to ask, I completely forgot, please check us out on social media. We're not a big operation. We run our social media, we run our website. So if you send us a message through, it's explodingstove.com or at explodingstove on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all of those things, you'll get directly to us. So if something comes up later, or you have something cool you want to share, you have a thought, please check us out on social media and our website. Let us know. We are almost too accessible. Maybe we should be more concerned, but we are very accessible.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to put all your contact information back up in the chat so that it's easily accessible for everyone. Well, thank you so much for all your great research that you've done, your great writing, your wonderful writers. The book is really interesting. I do encourage people to pick it up. You can get signed copies from BuckeyeBookFair.org. We have both the new book about the historic Black settlements as well as the lynching and mob violence in Ohio.
Thank you for having us. Thank you to everybody who joined us. We're always excited to see that people are willing to come talk to us about any of our books.
Yeah, if you come to Buckeye Book Fair next year, say hi to us.
Yeah, please. We are, whatever it happens in real life, we are there.
That's right. We do hope to return our annual fall Buckeye Book Fair in November, featuring a lot of Ohio authors. David and Elise are there almost every year. We do have more of these Ohio Book Talk discussions. As you can see, we have 4 more conversations, one a month. We hope you'll come and join us for some of those. We also want to thank again Ohio Humanities for sponsoring this, and we thank you all again for joining us. We hope you have a good evening, and please follow up through our websites or through email if you have any questions for any of us. So thanks again, everybody.